Why would the most dangerous man in Nashville spend a fortune on cameras just to catch a phantom? And what happens when the monster you're hunting is the only one keeping your children alive? Joseph Alvarez was a man of power, a man of the hour. But inside his chest, his sanity began to sour. He sat in the glare with a frozen stare, watching a stranger enter his lair. The voices in Joseph's head were screaming. For weeks, and his toddlers, kept in the high-security iron cradle, had been thinning, their laughter replaced by a haunting silence. His head cook, Hilda, swore they were eating like royalty, presenting receipts for Wagyu and organic greens. But the lens doesn't lie. At 11:45 p.m., the screen flickered to life. A woman, dressed in rags and smelling of the forest, didn't reach for the jewelry safe. She reached through the cold iron bars of the nursery. Joseph's finger hovered over the alarm button, his heart hammering against his ribs. But then he saw it. His daughters weren't screaming. They were pressing their faces against the metal like starving birds. They weren't afraid of the shadow. They were desperate for her. In that flickering blue light, the Mad King realized the real villains weren't climbing over his fences. They were already serving him dinner. The monitors never slept. 12 of them, arranged in a grid above the mahogany credenza, like the compound eyes of some mechanical insect, cycled through the grounds of the Alvarez estate every 4 seconds, casting the study in a cold, restless blue. Joseph sat beneath their glow the way other men sat beneath cathedral ceilings. Not comforted, just small. Nashville's late spring pressed warm and sweet against the windows, honeysuckle riding the Tennessee breeze from the tree line, but inside the study, his glass of Blanton's sat untouched on the corner of the desk. The ice had long since surrendered. The voice came first as a frequency. Not words, never quite words, but a vibration behind the left ear, like a finger dragged along the rim of a crystal glass, just out of sight. Joseph pressed 2 tattooed fingers against his temple. At the ink there, a faded compass rose that a man in Memphis had needled into his skin 11 years ago, had blurred at the edges the way old truths tend to do. You are being watched. He knew the voice wasn't real. His physician in Brentwood, a careful man with careful eyes, had explained it twice using a diagram, and once using a metaphor about faulty radio receivers. Joseph had nodded both times and increased his security detail the following morning, understanding a thing and believing it were separate countries, and he had never held a passport for the second one. He pushed back from the desk and stood, 6'2" of tailored black wool and barely contained unease, moving to the window the way caged animals move to the corner, not for comfort, but for the illusion of a wall at their back. The grounds stretched out below, floodlit and manicured, the iron perimeter fence cutting a hard line against the dark tree belt that ran along the property's northern edge. Somewhere in those woods, something rustled. A deer, probably, or the wind reshaping itself through the cedars. Probably. He had built this place to be impenetrable. 3 acres in a gated enclave off Old Hickory Boulevard, full perimeter fencing, a security team that rotated in 8-hour shifts, and a residential wing for his daughters that his lieutenant, Calvin Perez, had quietly taken to calling the Iron Cradle. Though never within Joseph's hearing, the name had reached him anyway. Names always did. Rosalind was 3. Camille had just turned 2 in February, the birthday cake a small mountain of vanilla frosting that she had pressed her entire face into while the staff applauded. He kept that image like a pressed flower between the pages of a book he rarely opened, or his daughters were the one frequency that had never distorted. But lately the image had started to feel thin. He had noticed it first 2 Sundays ago, during the brief window each morning when he was permitted in his own house, to visit the girls before their nap. Rosalind had reached for him from her cot, and her wrist had looked so narrow inside his grip. Like a sparrow bone, he had told himself it was the light. If the iron cradle's windows faced north, and the morning light in there had a grey, diluting quality that made everything look washed out. He had told himself that 4 more times since. The voice behind his ear didn't believe him. Hilda Fernandez had been managing the household kitchen for going on 3 years, brought in from a private estate outside of Savannah, Georgia, with references that read like a culinary award ceremony, while she ran the food budget with the precision of a federal accountant and the authority of a woman who knew exactly how much she was worth. Every week she presented Joseph with a printed menu, color-coded, laminated, absurdly detailed, and every week he initialed it without reading past the first line, because the effort of caring about pureed butternut squash felt like one demand too many for a man already fighting a war inside his own skull. He trusted her. He trusted his whole staff. That was, he had come to understand in the last few sleepless days, the specific shape of his vulnerability. Rosalind's wrist, Camille's cheekbones, suddenly visible where they hadn't been in March. Joseph turned from the window. The monitors cycled. The northern tree line appeared on the center screen for exactly 4 seconds, dark, dense, unreadable, before the feed rotated away to the front gate. He watched the empty frame where the woods had been, at that nagging frequency, humming steadily behind his left ear. His daughters were thinning. His kitchen budget was swelling. And somewhere between those 2 facts lived a truth he hadn't yet been able to see. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call Calvin. Not about the staff. Not yet. About cameras. 41 of them. Hilda Fernandez arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, the way she always did. Not a minute early, never a minute late, as though punctuality itself were a form of dominance. She knocked twice on the study door with the back of one knuckle, a sound like a judge's gavel, and entered before Joseph had fully answered. She was a compact woman, somewhere in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair pinned so tightly against her skull that it seemed to pull her expression into a permanent state of composed authority. She carried the leather portfolio under her arm, the way a prosecutor carries evidence. Unhurried, certain of the outcome. Mr. Alvarez. She set the portfolio on the edge of the desk and opened it with the practiced ease of a woman who had performed this ritual dozens of times. This month's menu plan and itemized grocery statement. Joseph looked at the papers without touching them. The top sheet was laminated, as always, color-coded in soft greens and golds, fonts chosen for legibility, as a small decorative border running along the margin that he suspected she added specifically to make the numbers feel less like numbers. The monthly total sat at the bottom right corner, printed in bold. $9,840. He let that figure settle in his chest for a moment before he spoke. Tell me about the girls' meals. Hilda's expression did not flicker. Rosalind and Camille are on the developmental nutrition protocol I introduced in March. Organic sweet potato puree, wild-caught salmon in small portions, full-fat Greek yogurt with Manitoba honey. Camille has taken well to the avocado mash. Rosalind still resists the greens, but we fold them into the fruit blends. She delivered this the way a poet delivers a well-rehearsed stanza. Smooth, unbroken, warm enough to feel genuine. Joseph picked up the menu sheet. Or beneath the weekly adult meal plan, which was elaborate enough to sustain a Michelin-starred dining room, there was a subsection titled Iron Cradle Nutrition. Weeks 1 to 4, each entry was photographed. Small ceramic bowls arranged on linen, portions sized for tiny hands, colors vivid enough to suggest freshness. The photographs were beautiful. but they looked like the kind of images that appeared in parenting magazines, sold at airport bookstores in cities like Portland and Austin, aspirational and slightly unreal. He studied the photo of a salmon fillet beside a rosette of pureed sweet potato and a small ramekin of what the caption identified as honey-drizzled whole milk ricotta. Rosalind's wrist in his hand, thin as a question. "These photographs," he said quietly. "When were they taken?" "I document each meal for your records, or as requested." Hilda folded her hands at her waist. "I began the practice in January." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is deciding something rather than agreeing to something. The laminated sheet caught the morning light coming through the east-facing window, and for a brief, disorienting moment, the colors of those photographed meals, the orange of the sweet potato, the pink of the salmon, seemed almost too saturated, too perfect. The kind of perfection that existed in presentations, while not in kitchens. The frequency behind his left ear stirred, low and insistent. He pressed his thumb against the compass rose at his temple and breathed through it. "The grocery delivery," he said. "Who receives it?" "Myself and the kitchen staff. Deliveries come Tuesdays and Fridays from the distributor in Franklin. I sign off on each shipment. And the storage inventory. You manage that as well?" For the first time, something shifted in the space around Hilda's composure. But not her face. Her face remained placid as a frozen lake in January. But something in the way she redistributed her weight, a fraction of an inch, from her left foot to her right. It was the kind of movement that people make when they are recalculating. "I oversee it, yes. Darlene assists with the weekly audit." Darlene, kitchen assistant, hired by Hilda herself 18 months ago from a staffing agency in Murfreesboro that Joseph had never verified. He set the menu sheet back on the portfolio and pushed it gently toward her. "Thank you, Hilda. That will be all." She gathered the portfolio with the same unhurried certainty and left the room, pulling the door closed behind her with the soft, definitive click of someone who believed the meeting had gone in their favor. Joseph remained at the desk for a long moment after she was gone, the study settling back into its cool, monitored quiet. He reached for the glass of Blanton's, pulled out his phone and sent Calvin a text. He was in the middle of a long, slow sip of his coffee when he saw the text. It was from his sister, and it said, "I'm sorry, but I can't make it to the party tonight. I'm feeling under the weather and need to rest." He sighed and put his phone back in his pocket. He knew that his sister was probably right, and that he should probably take the day off work and rest up, but he also knew that he was feeling a little guilty about it. He had been looking forward to the party all week, and now he was going to miss it. He felt a little disappointed, but he also knew that it was probably for the best. He took a deep breath and decided to go to bed early and get some rest. He hoped that his sister would feel better soon, and that he would be able to make it to the party the next day, pulled out his phone and sent Calvin a single text message. 4 words, the same ones he had decided on the night before while staring at the darkened tree line. "Get me the cameras. If you like where this is heading, smash that like button now and subscribe to my channel. I have lots of stories for you." But Calvin Perez arrived at the estate before sunrise, the way he always did when Joseph's texts came without explanation. A man who had spent 11 years reading Joseph Alvarez's silences had learned to treat a 4-word message the way a sailor treats a dropping barometer, not as information, but as a warning to prepare. He found Joseph in the east corridor, standing at the window that overlooked the iron cradle's exterior wall. The girls wouldn't be awake for another 2 hours. The grounds were still grey and quiet, dew sitting heavy on the iron fence posts, the tree line to the north dark and unreadable in the early light. "You look like you haven't slept," Calvin said. "I need 41 cameras." Joseph didn't turn from the window. "High grade, the kind that still pull clean footage at 2 in the morning when there's no moon. Thermal if you can source them." Calvin was quiet for a moment. He was a lean man, olive-skinned and deliberate, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from discipline. He had long since stopped questioning Joseph's instincts on security. Those instincts had kept both of them breathing through situations that should have ended differently. "That's a significant installation," he said carefully. The current system has blind spots." Joseph finally turned, and Calvin read his face the way he always did, quickly, thoroughly, looking for the particular tension that meant the voices were loud today. It was there, but underneath it was something else, something colder and more deliberate than anxiety. "I want coverage on every room in the residential wing, both nursery angles, the kitchen, the food storage corridor, the staff quarters hallway, every point of entry from the north perimeter." Calvin pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Old habit. He wrote in it, with a mechanical pencil, tiny and precise. "What do you want to tell me what we're looking for?" "An assassin threat." Joseph said it flatly, the way a man states a cover story he has already decided on. "Word came through a contact in Louisville. Someone may have been contracted to move against the estate. That's what you'll tell the staff if they ask why the installation team is here." The notebook paused. Calvin looked up. "And what am I actually looking for?" The question sat between them for a beat. Outside, a bird started up somewhere in the cedars, a single insistent note repeated 4 times before it stopped. "Nothing yet," Joseph said. "Right now I just need the eyes." Calvin understood then that this was not about an assassin. He had known Joseph long enough to recognize the particular quality of a problem that Joseph was not yet ready to name. Some truths needed to be seen before they could be spoken. He wrote a figure in his notebook, circled it, and closed the cover. "I know a team out of Knoxville, private contractors, bonded. They've done sensitive installations before. They can be here by Thursday." "Wednesday, Wednesday," Calvin repeated, without argument. "I'll need a layout of every room you want covered." Joseph handed him a folded sheet of paper he had already prepared. Floor plan of the entire residential wing, marked in red pen, angles notated in the margins in his cramped, deliberate handwriting. Calvin unfolded it, scanned it, and noticed that the iron cradle had 4 separate camera positions marked, more than any other single room in the house. He said nothing about that. "No one on staff knows the real count," Joseph said. "Not the number, not the placement, not that the footage feeds here." He gestured toward the study behind him. "If anyone asks, the installation is external perimeter only. Threat response protocol. Standard." "Understood." "Calvin." Joseph's voice dropped, not in volume but in register, the tone he used when something actually mattered. "No one, not Darlene, not the gate team, nobody." The name Darlene was not one Joseph typically mentioned directly. Calvin filed that detail away without expression. "No one," he confirmed. After Calvin left, Joseph returned to the desk and sat for a long time without moving. The monitors cycled overhead, the same blind rotation they had always run, and he watched the north tree line appear and disappear in its 4-second window with the patience of a man who had finally decided to stop guessing and start knowing. Wednesday felt very far away. He opened the desk drawer and removed the folder he had built over the past 3 days. Grocery receipts, delivery logs, a printed photograph of Camille's birthday cake, beside a more recent photo he had taken quietly on his phone. The difference between her face in February and her face last week. Or he set the two images side by side and left them there in the blue light while Nashville woke up around him. The Knoxville team worked without conversation, which Joseph appreciated. They arrived Wednesday morning in an unmarked white van, 4 men in grey coveralls who moved through the estate with the efficiency of surgeons, drilling, mounting, running cable through wall cavities with a tidiness that left no visible seam. By 6 in the evening, they were gone. And by 7, Joseph was seated at the desk in his study, facing a newly expanded monitor grid that made the old one look like a child's attempt at surveillance. 41 feeds, every angle, every corridor, every shadow. He sat with a legal pad and went through them methodically, the way he approached everything that mattered, room by room, angle by angle, checking coverage overlap, identifying any remaining blind spots, and noting them in the margin. The iron cradle appeared on 4 screens simultaneously, each from a different quadrant. He spent longer on those 4 than on all the others combined. The girls were asleep by the time the system went live. Rosalind curled on her side, one small fist tucked beneath her chin. Camille flat on her back the way she always slept, arms flung wide like she was trying to hold the whole cot. While watching them through the monitors produced a feeling in Joseph's chest that he had no adequate word for. Something between relief and a grief he couldn't yet locate the source of. He poured 2 fingers of Blanton's and settled in to wait. The first 3 nights produced nothing unusual. Staff moved through their routines with the unremarkable rhythm of people who believed they were not being watched. Hilda locked the kitchen at 9:15 each evening. Darlene took her break at 10, standing at the side entrance for 12 minutes with her phone and a cigarette. The gate team rotated on schedule. The north tree line sat dark and still and gave nothing away. On the 4th night, at 11:43, camera 37 moved. Not the camera itself, the motion sensor attached to it, triggered by movement along the northern fence line where the estate's boundary met the tree belt. Joseph had been half watching, his eyes heavy with the accumulated debt of 4 poor nights of sleep, when the feed indicator pulsed amber and pulled his attention to the upper left quadrant of the grid. He straightened in the chair. A figure emerged from the tree line slowly, with the particular caution of someone who had learned to read a space before entering it. Not the reckless speed of a threat, something more considered than that. The figure was wrapped in layers despite the Tennessee warmth, there slightly as though listening. Joseph's slightly as though listening. Joseph's hand found the desk phone. His thumb rested on the button that connected directly to the gate team's radio. He did not press it. Instead, he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the monitor. The thermal overlay Calvin had insisted on was earning its cost. The figure resolved in amber and pale gold against the cool blue of the grass, slight in frame, moving with a stillness that read less like aggression and more like someone navigating by memory. Whoever this was, they had walked this fence line before. The path they chose was too deliberate for a first visit. A scout, Joseph thought, or the Louisville cover story he had invented for his staff, had apparently anticipated a reality he hadn't meant to predict. Someone was mapping the perimeter. Someone had been sent ahead of something larger. He picked up his phone and sent Calvin a message. North fence. Camera 37. Review the last 10 minutes. Keep it quiet. Calvin's response came back in under 2 minutes. Saw it. No gang markings visible. Clothing's irregular. There could be freelance. Joseph watched the figure pause at the corner post, where the fence made its eastward turn toward the iron cradle wing. They stood there for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, head tilting again toward the estate. Then they retreated, back into the tree line, absorbed by the cedars as smoothly as water into dry ground, and the thermal feed returned to its uniform, untroubled blue. He sat with the empty screen for a long time after, the legal pad open on the desk. There had been nothing predatory in that movement. There had been nothing predatory in that figure's posture, no target assessment in the way they'd stood at the fence corner. They hadn't been studying the security. They hadn't been studying the building. They had been listening toward the iron cradle. He did not sleep. He told himself he would. 2 hours, or maybe 3, enough to clear the fog from behind his eyes. But the image of that figure standing at the fence corner, head tilted toward the iron cradle, had lodged itself somewhere beneath rational thought and refused to be reasoned away. By 4 a.m, he had pulled up every archived feed from the iron cradle cameras and begun watching from the beginning. Not from the night the figure appeared. From the moment the system went live. 4 screens, 4 angles, what 112 hours of footage, and Joseph Alvarez watched it, the way a man reads a letter he suspects contains something that will undo him, slowly, without looking away, because looking away would only delay the undoing. The first thing he noticed was the light. The iron cradle's play area occupied a room on the residential wing's north side, and its windows, 3 of them, barred on the exterior with the same iron framework that gave the wing its name, faced the tree belt. It was a large room by any measure, furnished with padded mats and low shelving units, and the kind of colorful considered decor that said someone planned this space for children. It should have felt warm. On the monitors, in the grey resolution of archived footage, it felt like the inside of a vault. The girls spent most of their daylight hours in there. Rosalind had developed a habit of sitting near the window on the east side, pressing her palm flat against the glass the way children do when they're trying to reach something on the other side. Camille walked circuits around the room's perimeter with a seriousness that no 2-year-old should carry, dragging a worn, stuffed rabbit by one ear. Neither of them laughed. Not once, across 4 days of footage, did Joseph hear either of his daughters laugh. He turned the volume up on the monitor and sat with that silence, like a man sitting with a verdict. But the staff interactions were brief and formulaic. A woman, Darlene, identifiable by the yellow lanyard she always wore, appeared twice daily to change linens and check the room. She did not linger, did not speak to the girls beyond functional instruction. The interactions lasted 4 minutes on average, and when Darlene left, Joseph watched her close the door behind her, and, on the exterior camera angle, heard the unmistakable sound that he had been unconsciously bracing for. The lock engaging. He played it again, and again. 4 different days, morning and afternoon, Darlene leaving the iron cradle, pulling the heavy door shut, and the bolt sliding home from the outside. Joseph set down his glass very carefully on the desk. The iron cradle had been designed with a locking mechanism on the exterior. He knew that. He had approved the security specification himself, the logic being that the room needed to be securable against external threat, an intruder, a breach, a scenario where the girls needed to be sealed inside for their protection. The lock existed as a last resort, a feature of crisis, not of routine. On the footage, it was routine. He rewound to a Tuesday morning, 9:47. Rosalind was standing at the door, small hand flat against it, pressing in that particular way that meant she wanted it to open. She stood there for 6 minutes. Joseph watched her count the time in the corner timestamp, his jaw tightening with each passing minute. But after the 6th minute, Rosalind lowered her hand and walked back to the window. She sat down beside the glass, pressed her palm against it instead, and stared out toward the tree line. The tree belt. The same direction the figure had been listening from. Joseph pushed back from the desk and stood, needing to put distance between himself and the monitors without being able to actually leave them. He walked to the window, then back. The frequency behind his left ear was not a voice tonight. It was something simpler and more brutal. A pressure, steady and insistent, the sensation of something enormous trying to get through a very small opening. His daughters were being locked in. Not at night, not during threat scenarios. During the day, while Nashville went about its ordinary business, and Hilda Fernandez prepared her laminated menus, and Calvin Perez managed the gate rotation, and Joseph himself sat in this study managing an empire of iron. His daughters were being locked into that north-facing room. He thought about Rosalind's hand against the door. 6 minutes. Then her hand against the window, reaching both times for something on the other side. Joseph returned to the monitors, pulled up the north exterior camera, went and stared at the tree line in the early grey of morning. Whatever was in those woods, his daughters already knew about it. He almost missed it. The timestamp read 11:41 when Joseph's eyes, heavy with 6 straight hours of footage review, nearly closed for the last time. He had been cycling through the north exterior feeds in sequence, watching the tree line with the methodical patience of a man who had already decided that patience was the only tool left to him. The Tennessee night on the monitor was still and moonless, the thermal overlay painting the grass in cool, uniform blue. Then the amber bloom appeared at the tree line's edge. He sat forward so quickly the chair groaned beneath him. She moved the same way she had 4 nights ago, low, deliberate, reading the space before committing to it. But tonight she was closer than before. Tonight she was carrying something. The thermal feed rendered it as a warmer pocket of color cradled against her midsection, both arms curved around it, the way a person carries something they cannot afford to drop. She crossed the open ground between the tree line and the fence with a steadiness that suggested she had mapped the distance in daylight, had counted her steps, had decided exactly how far she could go and where she needed to stop. She stopped at the north-facing window of the iron cradle. Joseph's hand was on the desk phone. He did not pick it up. On the interior camera, angle 3, the one mounted in the northeast corner, he watched Rosalind stir in her cot. Not the gradual surfacing of a child waking from deep sleep, but the immediate, purposeful alertness of someone responding to a familiar signal. Rosalind sat upright, swung her small legs over the side of the cot, and padded across the padded floor toward the window, with a certainty that hit Joseph somewhere beneath the sternum like a closed fist. She had done this before. Camille was awake seconds later, the stuffed rabbit dragging behind her as she crossed to the window and pressed her face against the glass beside her sister. Both girls, cheeks flattened gently against the pane, looking out into the dark toward the figure at the fence. On the exterior feed, the woman reached into the bundle she carried and produced something. A bowl, small and metal, the kind sold at camping supply stores in Chattanooga and Asheville. She worked with the efficient economy of someone accustomed to having neither time nor abundance to waste. A spoon appeared. She stirred whatever was in the bowl once, twice, and then, with a gentleness so deliberate it seemed almost ceremonial, she reached through the iron bars of the exterior window frame. But the window itself was latched from inside. The bars were not enough to stop a hand. A bowl small enough, angled carefully, could pass between them. Rosalind unlatched the window. Joseph had not known she could do that. His 3-year-old daughter, whom he had believed safely sealed behind glass and iron, had learned to work the interior latch. Now had been doing so at 11:40-something in the evening, while the staff slept, and the gate team watched the front perimeter, and Joseph himself had been staring at laminated menus without reading them. He watched Rosalind take the bowl through the bars with both hands. watched Camille press close beside her. The woman outside remained at the window, kneeling now, her face at the level of the bars, speaking to them in what the exterior microphone picked up as a low, continuous murmur. It had ever been spoken to a frightened child, had ever been spoken to a frightened child in the dark. "It's all right. I'm here. Eat." The girls ate, passing the spoon between them in the way children share when sharing has become instinct rather than instruction. Whatever was in that bowl disappeared in under 3 minutes, not because the portions were generous, but because the hunger was not. Joseph set the phone down. The frequency behind his left ear had gone entirely quiet for the first time in weeks. In its place was something he had no clinical name for, a pressure behind the eyes that had nothing to do with anxiety, and everything to do with the specific, terrible clarity of finally seeing a thing you had been circling for a long time without knowing it. A woman with no roof over her head in the woods bordering his estate in Nashville, Tennessee, who had been scavenging food and carrying it through the dark to feed his daughters through iron bars, because she had heard them crying from the forest edge, and no one else had come. He looked at the 2 photographs still sitting on the corner of his desk. Camille in February, Camille last week. Then he looked at the screen where the woman outside was slowly gathering her empty bowl and rising to leave, already folding herself back toward the darkness she had come from. That he finally understood what his daughters had known for weeks. She was not the danger. He waited until morning, not because he needed time to decide. The decision had been made the moment Rosalind's small hands accepted that bowl through the bars, but because Joseph Alvarez had learned long ago that actions taken in the white heat of revelation tend to leave edges that cut the wrong people. He sat with the footage running on a quiet loop until the Nashville dawn pressed pale gold through the study windows, and then he sent Calvin a single message. "Come alone. Bring Hector." Hector Sloan was the estate's head of internal security, a broad-shouldered man from Bowling Green, Kentucky, who had the particular gift of being able to move through a building without the building seeming to notice. He arrived with Calvin at 7:15, and Joseph met them at the study door rather than sitting behind the desk. Standing felt more honest for what needed to be said. He did not show them all of the footage. He showed them enough. Calvin watched the screen with the stillness of a man absorbing something that was rearranging his understanding of the last several months. Hector watched with no expression at all, which was its own kind of answer. When the clip ended, Joseph turned the monitor off and looked at them both. "Or Hilda's quarters," he said. "Her office, the kitchen storage and the cold rooms, every inch. I want documentation before anything is moved." Calvin nodded once. "Timeline?" "Now." They were methodical about it, which was what Joseph had needed from them. Hector photographed each room in sequence before touching anything, a practice Joseph had insisted on years ago for reasons that had always been professional and were now deeply personal. The documentation would matter later. He needed to see the shape of this thing in full before he decided what to do with it. Hilda's private quarters were in the East Wing staff corridor, a well-appointed suite that Joseph now recognized, with the particular vision that comes after revelation, was far better furnished than any household position warranted. A sitting room, new curtains, an oak writing desk that had not come with the estate, small indicators, each one unremarkable in isolation, or that assembled into a pattern he should have read months ago. Calvin called him at 7:53. "You need to come down here." The writing desk's lower drawer was locked. Hector had the lock open in under 40 seconds, and what Joseph found inside was not subtle. Bundled currency, sorted by denomination, the kind of organized accumulation that spoke of a system rather than opportunism. Calvin had already begun counting while Hector photographed. The total, when Calvin read it out, which was just over $14,000, cash that had no explanation consistent with a head cook's salary. But it was the cold storage room that stopped Joseph completely. The estate's primary cold room ran along the kitchen's north wall, a commercial-grade walk-in unit installed when Joseph had bought the property, large enough to hold a month's provisions for the full household. He had never had reason to inspect it personally. That, he understood now, had been precisely the point. Hector pulled the handle, and the door swung open on a wave of cold air that carried with it a smell that answered every question before a single light was switched on. The fluorescent tubes flickered to life above shelving units, stacked with vacuum-sealed packages and labeled containers, and Joseph stood in the doorway and looked at what $9,840 a month had actually purchased. Wagyu beef, still in its butcher's packaging, dates running 3 and 4 weeks past. Organic produce reduced to dark liquid in its sealed bags. A whole side of salmon from a distributor in Portland, Oregon, bloated and discolored beneath its plastic wrap. Jars of imported honey, bottles of cold-pressed oil, wheels of cheese from a Vermont creamery, all of it purchased, logged in Hilda's meticulous records, presented in her laminated menus as meals served and consumed. None of it had ever been opened, as it had been bought to justify the budget and left here to rot while the receipts went into the portfolio, and the portfolio went on to Joseph's desk, and Joseph initialed the bottom line without reading past the first page, because the voices in his head had made concentration feel like running uphill in wet clothing. She had known exactly which weapon to use against him. Calvin appeared at his shoulder and said nothing for a moment, both of them standing in the cold, chemical light, and looking at the evidence of a theft conducted not in one bold act, but in 1,000 small ones, each one banked on the assumption that Joseph Alvarez was too fractured to look closely. "How long?" Joseph asked. Calvin exhaled slowly. "Based on the expiration dates on the earliest packages?" He paused. "At least 14 months." 14 months. Rosalind had been barely 18 months old 14 months ago. Camille had been newly walking. Joseph turned and left the cold room without another word, the door swinging shut behind him on all of that ruin, and walked back toward the study, where 41 monitors waited with the patience of things that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. Tomorrow, the staff would be summoned. He had the dining room table set. That was the detail that Calvin would remember afterward. Not the confrontation itself, not the footage, or not the faces of the staff when they understood what was happening, but the fact that Joseph had asked for the table to be laid properly. Placemats, water glasses, the good chairs pulled out and arranged with their backs to the wall-mounted television screen, as though this were an ordinary morning, as though everyone had simply been invited to breakfast. They arrived in ones and twos, beginning at 8 o'clock, summoned by a house-wide notification that Mr. de Alvarez requested the full residential staff in the dining room before their shifts began. 7 people in total. Darlene came in with her yellow lanyard and took a seat near the window without meeting anyone's eyes. The 2 gate staff who overlapped into domestic duties came together and sat together. The groundskeeper from the south lawn, the laundry attendant, and finally, at 3 minutes past 8, Hilda Fernandez, who entered the dining room the way she always entered every room, with the leather portfolio under her arm and the expression of a woman who had already decided how the meeting would conclude. Joseph was standing at the far end of the table when she came in. Not seated. Standing with both hands resting on the back of the chair at the table's head, his jacket on, his posture carrying that particular quality of stillness that the people who knew him had learned to read correctly. Calvin stood near the doorway to the kitchen corridor. Hector was positioned at the room's other exit with the practiced neutrality of someone whose presence alone was intended to communicate that exits were not currently a practical option. Hilda took a seat, placed the portfolio on the table in front of her, with its familiar, composed certainty. Joseph looked at the assembled faces for a moment without speaking. The room was quiet enough that the climate control system's low hum was audible, and somewhere distant in the residential wing, Rosalind could be heard talking to her rabbit in the private language that toddlers use when they believe no one is listening. "I want to show you something," Joseph said. His voice was level, conversational almost. Nor he reached for the remote on the sideboard, and the wall-mounted television behind him came to life, a 72-inch screen that normally displayed the estate's external camera grid during security briefings. Today it displayed a single feed, already queued, already paused at the 11:41 timestamp from 3 nights ago. He pressed play. The room watched, and the thermal footage resolved into something clearer than thermal once he switched to the standard night vision feed. Pearl Jenkins emerging from the tree line, moving to the iron cradle window, the bowl held against her body. The audio came through the dining room speakers with quiet fidelity. The low murmur of a voice speaking to frightened children in the dark. The small, urgent sounds of Rosalind and Camille eating. Joseph watched the staff watch the screen. Darlena's hand, resting on the table, slowly closed into a fist and did not open again. One of the gate staff leaned forward, then seemed to think better of it, and sat back. The groundskeeper, a decent man from Galatang who Joseph had never had cause to question, looked at the table in front of him with the expression of someone who wished they had called in sick. Hilda watched the footage with no visible change in expression whatsoever. That, more than anything else, was its own kind of answer. When the clip ended, Joseph set the remote down. "A woman with no home and no resources heard my daughters crying from the woods at the edge of this property," he said. "She scavenged what she could find. She carried it here in the dark, on foot, and fed them through the bars of a window, because the door was locked from the outside, and no one on this staff thought that required explanation." He paused. The room held its breath. "The cold storage room has been photographed and inventoried, or Hilda's desk has been photographed and inventoried." He said this without emphasis, without escalation, the way a man reads a balance sheet. "Those records are documented." He straightened from the chair back and adjusted his jacket, looked at Hilda one final time. She met his gaze with an equanimity that he recognized now for what it always had been. Not composure, but the practiced blankness of someone who had spent 14 months betting against his ability to see clearly. She had lost that bet. "Hector will speak with each of you individually," Joseph said. "Those whose involvement goes beyond negligence will hear from my attorneys. Those whose involvement was negligence alone," he let that word carry its full weight, "should consider this morning their last on this property." He walked out of the dining room without raising his voice once. The portfolio sat on the table where Hilda had left it, laminated menu face up, the colors still vivid, at the portions still perfect, the meals still describing a version of this household that had never existed anywhere except on paper. Calvin found Joseph in the study 10 minutes later, standing at the window facing the northern tree line. The woods were bright with late morning sun, the cedar branches moving in a slow Tennessee wind. "It's done," Calvin said. Joseph nodded, eyes still on the trees. "Then get me a coat. I'm going to take a walk." The woods were deeper than they looked from the window. Joseph had walked the estate's perimeter dozens of times in the years since he'd bought the property, always along the fence line, always with purpose and direction, and at least one other person within shouting distance. Walking into the tree belt itself was different. The cedar canopy closed overhead within 20 feet of the boundary. but pulling the temperature down by several degrees and replacing the estate's careful, managed quiet with a wilder kind of silence. Birds, wind in the upper branches, the soft give of the ground underfoot where the roots had been working through the Tennessee soil for decades without anyone's permission. He had pulled the coordinates from Camera 37's motion history. The figure always emerged from the same general quadrant, northwest of the iron cradle window, which suggested a camp or a shelter established with the same deliberate spatial logic that Pearl Jenkins brought to everything else he had observed her do. He found her in under 15 minutes. She had made her shelter in a natural hollow between 3 old cedars, using salvaged materials with an ingenuity that stopped him at the tree line of the small clearing. A frame of branches supporting layered tarp and canvas was a ground cover of flattened cardboard that had been kept dry with genuine care, a small fire pit ringed with stones that showed the patient engineering of someone who had learned to manage fire safely in close quarters. Beside the pit sat a collection of foraging containers, cleaned and sorted, a folding camp knife, a worn paperback with its spine broken in 3 places. Pearl Jenkins was sitting on an upturned crate outside the shelter when Joseph stepped into the clearing, and she saw him the same moment he saw her. No dramatic startle, no flight response, just a very still woman in her late 40s making the immediate, accurate assessment of her situation. Her face was weathered in the particular way that came from years lived outdoors in genuine exposure rather than recreation. Her eyes, dark and direct, moved from Joseph's face to his hands and back again, with the alertness of someone who had learned to read the difference between a threat and a person. Joseph stopped at a respectful distance and said nothing for a moment, letting her read him the same way she had read the estate grounds before approaching, carefully, on her own terms. "I've seen you on my cameras," he said. "Every night for the past 3 weeks. Before that too, I think." Pearl Jenkins looked at him steadily. "I heard them crying." Her voice was unhurried, carrying a low Georgia cadence that hadn't been entirely lost to years of displacement. "Heard it from the tree line. First time I thought it was an animal. Second time I knew it wasn't." Joseph absorbed this without responding immediately. She had heard his daughters crying from the woods in the dark and had moved toward the sound rather than away from it, while the people inside his house, paid and housed and fed by him, had moved steadily in the other direction. "What were you feeding them?" he asked. "Whatever I could find that was safe. No defensiveness in it. Just fact." "Oat mash, mostly. Now foraged when I could. Blackberries are good this time of year, this far into Tennessee. Sometimes rice I'd stretch from the food bank in Brentwood. Your little one, the older one, she likes it sweet. I started adding a little wild honey when I could find it." Rosalind. She liked it sweet. Joseph had not known that about his own daughter. He looked at this woman in her cedar hollow, with her clean containers and her carefully managed fire, and felt the full accumulated weight of everything the past 2 weeks had revealed settle into permanent clarity. Pearl Jenkins had built a life in these woods with the same methodical competence that he had brought to building an empire, and she had spent a portion of that life caring for his children out of nothing more than the conviction that a crying child in the dark required a response. "I want you to come inside," Joseph said. Pearl looked at him without moving. "Inside. The estate. All face east." He paused, choosing the next face east. He paused, choosing the next words with care. "My daughters know your voice. They trust your hands. I am asking you to let that happen at a proper table, in the light, with a kitchen that will finally be used for what kitchens are supposed to be used for." The clearing held the sound of wind in the cedars while Pearl Jenkins considered this. "I don't take charity," she said. "I know. Joseph held her gaze. I'm offering employment. My daughters need someone who has already demonstrated, without any incentive whatsoever, that they will show up in the dark and make sure those girls are fed. That is not a quality I can interview for. Pearl looked at the shelter she had built, at the careful, determined life assembled from salvage and patience, and then looked back at the man standing at the clearing's edge in his good coat, who had come into the woods alone and unarmed, and who was watching her the way a man watches something he has finally, at great cost, learned to see correctly. She stood up from the crate. I'll want to see the kitchen first, she said. The walk back through the cedars was quiet, the Tennessee morning light falling through the canopy in long, clean angles, and when they emerged from the tree line into the open ground of the estate, the iron cradle windows were already bright with sun. Or Joseph could see, from across the yard, two small faces pressed against the glass. Rosalind saw her first. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Both girls moving away from the window, back toward the interior, which meant they were running for the door. Running toward the sound of someone they trusted arriving. The frequency behind Joseph's left ear was completely, absolutely silent. He held the door open, and Pearl Jenkins walked into the light. Joseph Alvarez built walls to keep danger out, and nearly lost everything to the danger already inside. He learned that power without presence is just an expensive blind spot. That anxiety, left unchecked, becomes the perfect cover for those willing to exploit it. That the most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one who looks the part, and that genuine care cannot be faked, laminated, or line-itemed on a budget sheet. As sometimes the person with nothing is the only one giving everything. Drop a comment below. What's the one lesson from Joseph's story that hit you hardest? Let's talk about it.